Introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what is sure to be a great webinar. Our webinar today is on the U.S. military, climate change, and the destructive relationship between the two. Before we begin, we wanted to take a minute to promote some projects and events we are working on in Boston, DSA. Our internationalism working group, in particular, is organizing around Cuba. We've also helped organize 3 city council resolutions in the Boston area to call on President Biden to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list and end the U.S. Embargo of the island. We also are starting an introduction to internationalism reading group. If you are interested in Cuba or reading about internationalism, please sign up at the links below, and I can put them in the chat. Now, without further ado, let's introduce our webinar with Veterans for Peace member Gary Butterfield. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans who work to make the public aware of the deadly and burdening costs of war, as they have had the unfortunate experience of witnessing it firsthand. Today's speaker, Gary Butterfield, was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War and then declared as a conscientious objector and opposed the war while in the military. He is resolute in acting on his commitment to peace. He is past president of the San Diego chapter of Veterans for Peace and currently on the steering committee of the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. He is also a member of the San Diego 350.org and is keenly interested in the effects of militarism on the climate crisis. The relationship between the military and the global climate crisis is one constructive invisible cables. While the relationship is rarely spoken on, the relationship is terrifyingly taught. While Boston, in particular, does not house a significant number of military bases within its region, it is home to private companies such as Raytheon, who contract for and sell weapons to the U.S. military. While our bubble may seem distant, our proximity to this relationship is much closer than we often give it credit for. This is why we are thrilled to have Gary speak to us today on this pressing issue. Thank you, Gary.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. I'm glad you recorded that. I'm going to share a screen here. And do you all see that okay? And this is a small group, so I think if you want to ask a question during this presentation, make some noise. I'm looking at a screen. I do have a panel over here, but I'm willing to stop and discuss stuff as we go along since it's such a small group. Now, I got out of the Army, raised a family, and retired, and joined up with Veterans for Peace about 10 years ago. I'm a lifetime member, and I also joined San Diego 350.org, and I'm also a grandfather. And it became clear to me that we need to do a better job, obviously, of leaving this planet than what we're doing. And as I looked at the climate activists that I work with, I realized that they had either a blind spot or an underappreciation of the military's contribution to the climate crisis, particularly here in San Diego, where, unlike Boston, San Diego boasts that it has the highest concentration of active duty military troops anywhere in the world. Within Veterans for Peace, we call it belly of the beast. But anyway, looking at where you guys are politically and socially, some of this may be review for you, but keep in mind that my group, the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, decided to put this presentation together so that we could look at a group of climate people who are probably middle of the roaders, but they're not paying attention to what the military is doing to us environmentally and also with tax dollars. So we took a little bit of the anti-militarism that we strongly feel out of this because we want to broaden the appeal and get more people involved in this whole conversation. So we developed this about a year and a half ago. We've given it to about 100 different organizations. And so what I would like to ask you is to keep in mind that maybe this might be something that would be useful to another organization that you either belong to or know of, such as a UU church, a peace group. We have given this to Mass Peace Action and mass350.org, as well as some other groups, but we do it to sustainability clubs, to climate justice groups, and to others. So I'll get right into it here. One of the things that motivated me to do this was really when I looked at this, contrasting images of Greta Thunberg on the left side, warning us of the urgency of the situation we are in, and contrasting that with President Eisenhower from the 50s, when he warned us about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, saying that we're stealing from future generations. Now, you also have to realize that the doomsday clock is a symbol of the likelihood that a man-made global catastrophe is going to wipe us all out. And this has been maintained since about 1947, and by the members of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and it's a metaphor for threats to humanity, primarily from scientific and technical advances. And recently they've included climate change within this. Originally in 1947, the setting was 7 minutes to midnight. It's been set backwards and forwards 24 different times, the farthest being 17 minutes away from midnight in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the nearest being 100 seconds to midnight, which was instituted in 2020 to the present. And briefly, VFP's mission, as I say it, is to make sure that violence is not used and that war is abolished as an instrument of national policy. We believe that humans can resolve differences in other manners short of violence and war. The subgroup that I'm with, the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, is the only, to my knowledge, the public education and advocacy campaign on the impacts of militarism on the climate crisis. These issues have been evaded for many years by the mainstream environmental and climate organizations. We focus primarily on military emissions. We'd like to see them reported and reduced. We'd like to see the military budget reduced and redirected. We believe in climate justice and peace and a livable planet. So when we talk to climate people, we emphasize that there are three key points essentially to this presentation. The US military pollutes, and it pollutes a lot. The US military spends money, and it spends a lot of money, and you can do something about it. Now, I'm going to share a lot of information with you, and most of it can be found on our website, where we provide a bibliography and documentation to the facts and issues that we present here. I'll put that in the chat at the conclusion of the talk. But, you know, essentially, we've got to curtail emissions and make them peak by 2025 to avoid the IPCC's global target of an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And as Secretary Guterres of the UN said, he's declaring code red for humanity. And we see one example here of flooding in India. But we'll give you a couple of examples of the military and its emissions. You know, one of the most ubiquitous planes that the Air Force has is the B-52. It's been around probably for 50 or 60 years, but it consumes about as much fuel in an hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years. And when I would talk to my climate friends at 350, their lack of knowledge about the military's emissions was kind of stunning, but it's really not surprising because the US government has a concerted effort to avoid transparency of reporting military emissions. It goes back to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, where the US government successfully lobbied to exempt many military emissions from even being reported as a country's CO2 load. Ultimately, the US did not even sign on to this agreement, yet that exemption withstood. Fast forward to the Paris Accords in 2015, and it really didn't get much better, although there was a lot of discussion and hand-wringing. Military emissions were still not required. They were, quote, voluntarily to be reported. So right now, we don't have a robust system for reporting all of military emissions, and that's by design. And of course, the US has the world's largest military air fleets. There are about 13,000 in the US. The rest of the world combined has maybe 15,000, and it's ubiquitous. Here in San Diego, we concluded a protest movement against the Blue Angels. They bill it as the world's largest military air show. And this year we focused purely on the fact of the emission content of the jets. And when we did that, we approached local environmental and other groups, and we were able to actually get 18 local groups to endorse our actions to eliminate air shows, since they pollute the environment, and it's done solely on the basis of entertainment. You know, that's something that could be eliminated and not affect the operational readiness of the so-called military. But if the military were its own country, besides being the single largest institutional emitter, the aggregate puts the military as number 47 among about 190 countries of the world in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's just looking at their fuel usage, which comes from estimates, primarily out of Professor Neda Crawford at Brown University, the Cost of War project. We've got a huge emitter that's going unchecked. And the sources of those emissions are really widespread. The jets are probably the most prolific, but when you think about military activity, you think about logistics, R&D, troop training, wars, weapons sales, arms races, war games, cleanup and reconstruction afterwards. So there's a whole supply chain, if you will, that's involved in counting military emissions. And, you know, we can't forget about the approximately 750 bases that the US maintains outside of the country. We've got troops or military contractors in over 80 countries, and these bases range in size from the smallest lily pads that would typically pre-position weaponry and supplies to huge complexes that include their own housing, hospitals, bowling alleys, golf courses, and power plants. And you can see from the map, there's a huge cluster in the Mideast to protect the fossil fuels, to protect the oils, to protect the oil supply. You know, it's oils for war, war for oils. But, you know, this slide actually came from when the US ended its war in Afghanistan. We thought we'd see some type of, quote, peace dividend, but that really hasn't happened, in that The U.S. consistently is involved in war exercises with its allies throughout the entire world, whether it be in the Pacific Ocean or in the Arctic, in Norway. There are regular exercises and war games that involve US, British, Australian, South Korean, Japanese, and European armies and navies. And of course, the effects of war and preparation for war are polluting and long-lasting. Even 50 years after the Vietnam War, there's kids that are still maimed by unexploded ordnance or born with severe birth defects from the transgenerational impact of Agent Orange. Burn pits, open-air sites of solid waste incineration, have been the subject of lawsuits by veterans and civilians alike. Depleted uranium is used in tank armor and some bullets. It is 40% depleted of its radioactivity, but it retains all the toxicity of natural uranium. PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, are a group of man-made chemicals known as forever chemicals used in firefighting foam. And many bases have polluted drinking water surrounding it. Any war is climate destruction, and preparation for war is the same. And, you know, we have to say a word about the current war in Ukraine. The obvious environmental damage and emissions that arise from this type of destruction, but we also see many countries increasing their military spending with an increased arms race, which increases emissions. There's going to be an additional carbon footprint to rebuild after the war. We see unintended consequences to food supplies, water supplies. And to us at the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, the biggest issue is really that it's taken attention away from the climate crisis. You know, at some point, this war will have a negotiated settlement one way or the other, but the climate crisis isn't slowing down a bit. Now, in San Diego, we get a lot of discussion, if you will, or pushback, and they bring it to our attention that just look, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they've all come up with a climate action plan. Well, that was mandated in the last NDAA, and they have complied with putting together a nice PR package that's slick and glossy. It's full of noble goals, but, you know, until they can really come up with a synthetic jet fuel, reducing their carbon footprint by putting solar panels on infantrymen's backpacks and experimental biodiesel for naval vessels, isn't going to cut it. They want to be net zero by 2050, but they offer very few details on how to get there. And of course, we could talk for a long while about how climate change disproportionately affects the poor, how it affects the global South. And, you know, the sad fact is the military has recognized that climate change is important for quite a while, but they look at it in terms of being a threat multiplier. And many of their actions are to be able to fight more efficiently and really don't aim at true climate mitigation to reduce their carbon footprint. In fact, many of the developed nations have spent the most on border security in the past decade, including the US, such to the point that journalist Christian Periente refers to it as the armed lifeboat approach, where physical barriers are erected and military forces are amassed at the border to repel the approximately 1 billion people who could be displaced by 2050 due to climate change and natural disasters. A recent example of how the politicians deal with this is that they've diverted money from the UN Green Climate Fund, which the US had promised to spend to help developing countries, and they diverted it to weapons systems. I mean, that's really a kick in the shins. Of course, John Kerry, the climate czar, if you will, warns that a long Ukrainian war would threaten climate efforts. And that's especially true. Veterans for Peace has a statement on the Ukraine crisis, and the recent IPCC report calling for an immediate ceasefire and negotiation on both sides. So we've seen that the US has not been transparent about its enormous contribution of greenhouse gases to the climate problem. But we feel the other side of that coin is how the military is spending our tax dollars. Now, this is a kind of a busy pie chart, but I want you to just focus on the right hemisphere of blue. That was the proposed discretionary budget for 2022, which started out at $765 billion from Biden. Well, the Senate and the House, both Republicans and Democrats, got into this, and they increased that so that I think it's now about $850 billion. So it's really amazing that they can find these billions of dollars under a pillow somewhere, and they can't find anything for social programs or climate mitigation. But the $800 billion or so is not the whole story, because the misnamed Department of Defense, from their budget of $800 billion or so, you would think that the nuclear weapons program would be included in that. But that's not where it is. It's in energy and environment. Veterans benefits is a separate item. Homeland Security, border enforcement, intelligence agencies. And don't forget the massive annual interest payment that we have on this debt, specifically for defense or the Pentagon. And you've got a total that's over $1.25 trillion in the discretionary budget. As a contrast, the US spends more on the military than the next 11 countries combined. But it's, it reminds me of the quote from Martin Luther King, and it's a matter of priorities. Any nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So, the money is there to fight climate change. The political will is not. But, over the past 2 decades, since 9/11, $15 to $16 trillion has been spent on the global war on terror. And I imagine you, like any other group that I talk with, could find maybe some more helpful, useful ways to spend those trillions of dollars. The example here looks at the cost of shifting the national power grid would only be in at $4.5 trillion. So we call on a reduction of the Pentagon budget, as do many other organizations, such as the Poor People's Campaign, where they would suggest that $300 billion could be cut without harming operational readiness. Again, this breaks out where the money goes, where it could go, where if we had choices and if we had politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, they could spend that money more humanely. And this slide really kind of gets my goat in that the average CEO pay of the big five, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, $22 million for the CEO's compensation. That's contrasted with the average military salary of around $60,000. I know in San Diego, we have sailors and Marines whose families have to go on food stamps because they're not being compensated enough to make a survivable wage. And, you know, at Veterans for Peace, we have a unique perspective to look at the military's spending habits and how they pollute our environment. But we don't have a fight with the average serviceman. It's the politicians and the policymakers who are driving both of these issues into the dirt. So what can we do about this? I mean, I guess I should say about one last comment. The Pentagon has failed all three of the audits that it has undergone in the past 5 years. So not only do they spend a lot of money, we don't know, they can't account for it. So what have we accomplished? What is the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project? What are we doing? Well, we put together a robust website, and I'll put a link in the chat for that. We've done about 100 of these presentations. We have some trifolds. We have some bumper stickers that you or other groups could use at tabling. We've met with congressional representatives. We've also partnered with Representative Barbara Lee to put forth House Resolution 767, which calls for accurate emissions reporting of all military emissions from each of our military services. It has about 32 co-sponsors, and I think the only co-sponsor from Massachusetts is McGovern. But anyway, this will probably expire at the end of the year, and we're looking to get it reintroduced at next year's session. We also have a representative attending the COP27 meeting in Egypt, and she's reporting back on a regular basis. We also support the Golden Rule Peace Boat, which will actually be in Boston, I think, in April, and it is sailing for nuclear disarmament, global sustainability, and we'll be sporting one of our banners, U.S. militarism fuels climate crisis. Part of our actions also include some arrestable actions and opportunities called Stop the War, Save the Climate Project. We've had 3 of these, and I think we've had 9 people arrested and released, focusing on militarism, the war, the climate. This is Armistice Day coming up on Friday. Some people call it Veterans Day. But around this week, we have a number of actions. One I'd like to point out to you all and invite you to is November 16th in Boston at the Chase Bank at Downtown Crossing. And I'll put the link in the chat about this, and highlighting financial organizations that have a big hand in financing the military aims of this country. Another opportunity for you to do something is to sign a petition that World Beyond War has put forth to stop excluding military pollution from climate agreements. We believe that focusing on the pollution is kind of a gateway avenue into getting people to realize that rampant militarism is not healthy for us all, and it's something that's damaging to the climate as well. And of course, you can always call your Congress people to support HRES 767. You can visit our webpage, which I'll put in the chat at the conclusion of this. You can schedule a presentation through the website, which is what I would ask you to do, to see if maybe there's another group of people who might benefit from understanding all of this information. We also have bumper stickers and trifolds that can be useful at tabling opportunities. Thanks for your time. I look forward to having a discussion about this and see where we might go to spread the word and get more people involved in this. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Gary. Yeah, I would, at this point, I think we can open it to comments and questions that people have, as well as more general discussion. So if anyone's got anything to say, I think we're a small enough group. Dennis.
So thanks, Gary. That was an excellent, you really did an excellent job there, and included a lot of more recent stuff. I'm really happy about that. So I wanted to make a comment that about sort of the role of military interventions in the world, especially around, and you touched on it, Gary, about wars for oil. And so in addition to the huge carbon footprint of the military and the huge expense, including all those agencies that weren't even included as part of the Pentagon budget, I wanted to mention something about just a few interventions that the U.S. military has done. And the whole list was too long for me to try to tackle. So I brought up, I tried to put a couple of cases together. So one thing I wanted to mention is that back in 1953, the U.S. Government supported a coup in Iran that overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mossadegh and installed the Shah Pahlavi, that was the monarch for many years, a hated monarch. And of course, Iran is an oil country. Also, Iraq is an oil country. And so there was a war, not too many people remember now, but there was a war between Iran and Iraq. And during that war, between the years of 1981 and 1986, officials in the Reagan administration facilitated sales of arms to Iran, where it was otherwise banned. And they used the proceeds of selling those weapons to fund the Contras who were fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which was also a democratic government. And at the same time, the US provided military intelligence to the Iraqi government so that they could, both, let's you and him fight, they could fight each other. They were supporting both sides basically against each other. Then I just want to mention a little bit about the Afghan War and the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, of course, which people are more familiar with. The Afghan War, the war in Afghanistan was started by President Bush, or George W. Bush, to target Osama bin Laden, who had orchestrated 9/11. However, bin Laden was not from Afghanistan. He was actually Saudi Arabian with ties to the Saudi royal family. And he was what he was there in Afghanistan was supporting the Taliban. Now, the Taliban was built up by the United States when Afghanistan was being controlled or
invaded by the Soviet Union.
by the Soviet Union at the time. We built up the Taliban to fight against the Soviet Union. So even though then later bin Laden was killed in 2011, the US occupation still lasted until 2021, when finally the Taliban took over. But again, it was the CIA had funneled support to the Taliban for many years before that. And so, that was like sort of the consequence that they were very powerful at the time. Also, the second war in Iraq, it was justified by George W. Bush as necessary to remove weapons of mass destruction that had claimed that Saddam Hussein was hiding. And there was no evidence. There was no real concrete evidence, but those weapons were never found. Yet the occupation continued until 2011. So from 2003 to 2011. Anyway, so in all those cases, there was motivation, and it's hard to prove that it was done for oil, but there was certainly the control of resources, especially oil. The other thing that about Afghanistan is that the American company Unocal had plans to build an oil pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. So there was always oil involved. I just wanted to mention that. That's another aspect. And so the claims about being, pro-democracy and all that, helping countries out, those are like 4 examples of that really belie that kind of talk.
I mean, we can go back to the Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a false flag. It didn't happen, and yet we used it as a pretext for escalating the war against Vietnam. And I want to go back to the Iraq wars. I mean, Petraeus was quoted of saying it's all about oil. The military runs on oil, and this war is for oil. And politicians were saying this war will pay for itself because of the oil that's based in it. But, when we look at the value of the fossil fuel oil and the fossil fuel industry in the Afghanistan war, because the supply lines were so long and so vulnerable to transport fuel, that's actually a motivator for the army to come up with some type of alternative fuel or alternative power for their vehicles, because they're exposing their troops to such jeopardy from such long supply lines. but we spend about $81 billion a year protecting oil in the Persian Gulf. And, you know, the oil companies don't pay the taxes to reimburse us all for that, but that's like a subsidy for the oil companies. But anyway, that's one aspect of it. And of course, the interventions that the U.S. has undertaken are usually for economic reasons and not for the noble causes that they state about democracy, etc. Let me ask you all a question. You know, I cited some facts about consumption and usage and emissions and stuff. Is that something that you all are familiar with as a matter of course, or is this new information for you?
Details were not known to me. Just general, but it was good to do a little bit of research as well. And so I had, my memory was always never as accurate as, you know, I could find information for on the web. But you did a very thorough job, I thought.
I've certainly heard the general idea that the U.S. military is like the world's largest institutional polluter in the abstract, but it was definitely good to see a lot of the statistic, the hard numbers around that.
And the reason that it's not, you know, widely discussed is because it's purposefully not a transparent topic. I mean, the U.S. has gone to various ends to exempt military emissions from being reported. Now, we are seeing much more discussion of it. In fact, there are three papers being given at the COP27 meeting in Egypt about military emissions. In Costa Rica, we believe, which abolished its military, Costa Rica is set to introduce a resolution that all military emissions be counted, and they're counted for the country that makes them, not the host country. Where if like Diego Garcia, if the U.S. has a base, should those be counted against the U.S. or Diego Garcia? Well, of course, the U.S. says, well, that's somebody else's problem. But anyway, there's more and more discussion about it. And our goal is to get climate people to gain a better appreciation of the military's role in all of this. You know, we appreciate that local climate activists are focused locally for the most part and are doing good work, but we can't forget about the other existential threat, because the military also does include nuclear weapons. And we you know, we've been asked to change our behavior and are held accountable, and we should do the same of our institutions. Thanks for your time and your attention. You know, if you find an opportunity for us to talk further about it, that would be great, whether it be, you know, some type of sustainability club, a political action club, a college course, a college group. We're looking to do something with Kappa, the Chicago area peace action down the road, but more people need to be tuned into this. I mean, that's $1 trillion that could be spent helping people.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for coming. It's been great to get this recording as well. I'll share your links wherever we share.
Okay, thanks. I look forward to that. Thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Dennis.
All right.